Okay, now we're being recorded. She announced that. Well, I would like to begin the meeting as I usually do with an overview of the group. I know many of you have heard this before, but we have newcomers, and it's a great opportunity to tell you a little bit about our group. We started close to 20 years ago, maybe it's more than 20 years ago now, as a reaction to the Iraq War. And we've been dedicated to the cause of peace and justice ever since. We've been going strong ever since. And we do that with demonstrations, with actions, and with speakers. And we also join with other groups whenever we can that are also dedicated to those causes. So of course, our name is Huntington Woods, but our membership is from throughout Southeast Michigan. We just happen to have started in Huntington Woods, and that's the origin of our name. Over the years, we've had many, many speakers, national and local, ranging from Tom Hayden to Daniel Ellsberg, to Abdul Sayed, to Phyllis Bennis, to Jeff Cohen, to Norman Solomon, to Andy Levin, and many other journalists, politicians, activists, and academics. And for 2 years, and I guess it must be going towards 2.5 years, ever since George Floyd was killed, we've held a racial justice demonstration on the corner of 11 and Woodward every Monday. We start at 5:30. We're still at it, and I want to invite any of you, all of you, to join us. It's really an amazing experience. What happens is that the cars honk like crazy. They really seem to appreciate us being there and speaking for them. And it gets to be a wonderful experience once you get there. So all you have to do is show up. As I said, we start at 5:30, but I think we will be starting at 5 now that the time change is coming up upon us. And we're there for about an hour. So once again, please join us there. And as you can see, we've always been dedicated to issues of war and peace and justice. So that brings us to tonight's meeting, which could not be more timely. Of course, it's about Ukraine, and Ukraine is in the news every single day. And it has a wonderful title, which is Back to the Future, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Ukraine. So we're going to be talking about looking back and looking forward and what we think will happen in Ukraine and what should happen in Ukraine. And to do that, I'm delighted to introduce one of my very favorite people, Rich Peacock. He is co-chair of Peace Action of Michigan, and he's a member of the Huntington Woods Peace Group Steering Committee. And Reverend Rich Peacock is the most up-to-date person when it comes to the worldview of war and peace. So I'm delighted to introduce Rich. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Linda. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Is that working?
Yes, it is working. Yep.
Thank you. The Cuban Missile Crisis and Ukraine. On October 14, 1962, 60 years ago, when you are about age 15 or so, a U-2 spy plane spotted Soviet ballistic missiles being installed in Cuba so they could be fired into the United States 90 miles away. On October 22nd, 1962, President John F. Kennedy went on TV to tell the world that Nikita Khrushchev had planted missiles in Cuba and that the US was using Navy ships to impose a naval, quote, quarantine, unquote, on Cuba. Khrushchev threatened to sink US ships if they interfered with Soviet ships going to Cuba. Both presidents placed their militaries on alert. JVK demanded that Khrushchev withdraw the missiles. Some background. In April of 1961, the US had invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, trying to oust Castro, but that failed. In November of 1961, the US established Operation Mongoose to overthrow Castro and communism with paramilitary operations, economic warfare, and sabotage on the island. On August 23, 1962, JFK issued National Security Memo number 181, a directive to engineer an internal revolt that will be followed by a US military intervention. And a speedboat strafed a Cuban seaside hotel, killing Russians and Cubans, and sugar shipments got contaminated. So Operation Mongoose provided a timetable for the, quote, open revolt and overthrow of the communist regime, end quote. So why did Khrushchev ship nuclear missiles to Cuba? Well, one obvious reason is he wanted to defend his ally from a US attack. And he wanted to show the world that Russia had achieved nuclear parity. More background. Khrushchev felt vulnerable to a US first strike nuclear attack. He had only 20 unreliable ICBMs. We had 284, plus 2,000 nuclear bombers. Overall, we had a 17-to-1 advantage. Khrushchev wanted to change the balance of terror so that we actually had mutually assured destruction, what we call MAD. And he delegated the authority to his field commander in Cuba to fire their tactical nuclear weapons. That was dangerous. I believe that no one should have the authority to fire nukes all by themselves, not even the US president. What JFK did was he threatened the entire USSR. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. On October 27, 1962, what happened was the most dangerous moment in human history. You see, a US Navy destroyer was dropping depth charges, bombarding a submerged Soviet submarine armed with nuclear torpedoes near Cuba. These depth charges were rocking the submarine, preventing it from surfacing because it needed oxygen. It really got hot down in the sub. The oxygen supply got curtailed. Crew members began to faint. They thought war was breaking out. 2 of the 3 submarine commanders ordered the crew to get ready to fire the nuclear armed torpedoes. One of them said, quote, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." But it required all 3 of the commanders to agree to fire nuclear armed torpedoes. One wanted orders from Moscow, so he refused. A guy named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. I want to talk about JFK's top 10 actions. He accused Eisenhower of a non-existent missile gap that favored Moscow. He won a 15% increase in Pentagon spending and accelerated the building of nuclear missiles. He consulted Ike, who preferred military action to isolate Havana. But JFK set one goal: remove the missiles. Even though the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to also oust Castro. Curtis LeMay wanted an all-out war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff all recommended an immediate airstrike on Cuba. JFK deferred a decision. Marine Commander David Shoup cursed him out. JFK also ratcheted up the alert status of our nuclear forces there were 66 B-52 nuclear bombers constantly airborne at this time. JFK, as I said, promised full retaliation against the Soviet Union. He initiated discussion about pulling our US Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. He sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to give Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin the threat on October 27. Quote, if you don't commit to remove those missile bases out of Cuba tomorrow, we will remove them. But JFK ignored a more recent, more demanding letter from Khrushchev, and he answered to Khrushchev an earlier, less aggressive letter. He pledged not to invade Cuba for the removal of missiles. And he made an implicit reference to the removal of the US missiles from Turkey. Later, Khrushchev wrote that he saw Kennedy as one who sought solutions through negotiations. On Sunday, October 28, 1962, Khrushchev answered and announced that he was withdrawing the missiles. Within 6 months, all the missiles were withdrawn from Turkey and Cuba. Decades later, Khrushchev's advisors revealed that 43,000 Soviet troops had been hiding on the island to defend the missiles in case of an invasion. JFK was right. If the US had attacked, he would have started a war with the Soviet Union. Behind the scenes, there's an unsung hero, the United Nations General Secretary, U Thant. He asked Kennedy and Khrushchev for a moratorium on the conflict at sea. He actually proposed the Soviet missile withdrawal from Cuba in exchange for the US agreeing not to invade Cuba. He went to Cuba to calm down President Fidel Castro. And then back at the United Nations, he aided the Soviet and American negotiators on how the removal of the Soviet missiles was to be verified. An unsung hero. One outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the US and USSR created a telephone hotline between the White House and the Kremlin to facilitate communication during a crisis. Another outcome was probably JFK's June 10, 1963 speech at American University entitled World Peace. Some think this is one of his best speeches. He said that total war makes no sense because it releases worldwide deadly poisons. He said that we must beware of distorted views that we might have of Russian leaders. He said that we must halt the arms race and make the world safe for diversity. He called for, quote, general and complete disarmament, unquote. He took the initiative and he said the US would no longer conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere. And the Kennedy-Khrushchev cooperation gave impetus to the Limited Test Ban Treaty of August 5, 1963. Now, there were some other outcomes. The Soviets refused to accept nuclear domination by the US, and they opted to invest whatever was needed to overcome their inferior position. They achieved rough nuclear parity by the early 1970s. That ensured that there would be mutually assured destruction, that would be MAD. In turn, MAD caused the US to put more of our taxes into paying to make sure we had a first strike advantage. Plans for fighting and possibly even winning a nuclear war emerged as too tempting to pass up. Nuclear arsenals swelled beyond numbers previously imagined. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara argued that a reasonable goal for fighting a nuclear war with the Soviet people would be killing 25% of the Russians. That would be 55 million people back then, or 6 times Michigan's population. At the beginning of our 21st century, only 51 US strategic warheads would be needed to kill so many people. Yet the US arsenal numbered over 10,000. Americans learned a faulty lesson that Khrushchev blinked. Only JFK and 6 advisors knew about the secret deal to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Because if anyone found out, they would smear JFK as an appeaser, and he might lose the next election. Politicians, war planners, and Americans were thus led into falsely believing that the lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis was to stand firm and threaten the Soviets. But the crisis passed because JFK compromised. Nevertheless, most of us believe the US forced Khrushchev to back down because of threatening him. So the US practice of preparing and threatening to strike first with nuclear weapons was reinforced. And the US and other nuclear armed nations have threatened to fire nuclear bombs over 40 times. Neither the US nor Russia have renounced the right to fire nuclear weapons first. Make sure I get the right. Whoops, I think I skipped one. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the 8 key drivers for building nuclear warheads and missiles. They have to do with deterrence. The idea that a nuclear attack must be deterred, and you do that by building more nukes. So the idea was deterrence prevents war between nuclear powers. Well, look at Ukraine, closer than any time. Deterrence is necessary to reassure allies. Oh, but nukes have made Europe nervous more than once. Any move away from deterrence is destabilizing. To the contrary, only no first use and requiring more than one president to launch nukes would bring security. It's been said that nukes deter large-scale conventional attacks. Once again, what about Ukraine? And that nukes deter chemical and conventional attacks. What about Iraq, Syria, white phosphorus in Afghanistan and Iraq? Nukes confer status and prestige. Well, they do that, and they drive non-nuclear armed nations to get nuclear weapons. Everybody wants to join the club. Nukes cost less than conventional arms, but consider the health costs in making and testing atom bombs. Nuclear weapons establishments are needed to maintain expertise. That's right. But the result is that nuclear arsenals across the globe are set to grow in the next decade for the first time since the Cold War. Martin Luther King was a prophet who saw the crisis as a time to connect nuclear disarmament to racial and economic justice, to take some of the billions of dollars spent on nuclear devices to increase teacher salaries and rebuild schools. He said, "Let us not misuse the success of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but instead strengthen the country by granting African Americans the right to vote, eliminate the poll tax, and end the system of segregation." Words that are still relevant. Coretta Scott King, 20 years later in 1982, at the United Nations declared, "All of our hopes for equality, justice, economic security, and a healthy environment depend on nuclear disarmament." But we have ignored the prophets. We have had the bomb on our minds since 1945, It was first our weaponry, then our foreign policy, and now our economy. The prophets would say, nukes are our supreme idols. And so nuclear war stands on two legs, a permanent war economy and a permanent enemy. So the question is, who has nukes on their mind now? Well, there are 9 nuclear armed states, and they continue to modernize their nuclear arsenals. Despite a small increase in the number of nuclear warheads in 2021, nuclear arsenals are expected to grow over the next 10 years. Russia and the US possessed 90% of the usable nukes. And there you see all the numbers. They add up to a nuclear winter, to smoke and dust clouding us into virtual darkness for months, creating radiation sickness, destruction of crops, food scarcity, hunger, famine, conflict, real food fights over food. The US is planning to replace our 400 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles with new missiles called Sentinels. They're backed by a very powerful IBM caucus. And what this caucus has succeeded is that Northrop Grumman is the sole bidder to build the Sentinel. So with only one bidder, you can expect the cost to grow up. This is a huge weapon, as tall as a bowling alley. The purpose of this weapon is to act as a sponge, to draw Russian ICBMs into those states, starting with North Dakota and Wyoming. So really, this Sentinel is a money pit missile or an omnicider. Military contractors have donated over 1.2 million to the 6 senators and 15 million to 64 members of influential committees. The 5 largest nuclear weapons makers, there they are. They make huge profits off of taxpayers to build these doomsday machines. The profiteers are some of the largest donors to members of Congress. These profiteers from Armageddon employed 380 lobbyists in 2020. But there are some good guys. 122 countries voted in 2017 to approve the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, despite heavy pressure from the United States not to do so. As of August, 68 countries have ratified the treaty, so it is now in effect. Nuclear weapons are illegal. Kim Bergier and the Michigan Stop the Nuclear Bombs campaign lead us to demonstrate every year on January 22nd, the anniversary of the treaty going into effect. Again, the good guys, nuclear bombs are illegal. This hugely influential group of mayors represents 1,400 cities that have populations over 30,000. In August 2021, they unanimously passed a resolution calling on Washington to embrace the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The US mayors want to rid the world of nuclear weapons and use the taxes saved to save our cities from broken bridges and roads. Climate scientists know that the US military is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Climate scientists know that even a limited nuclear war will spew dirt into the sky, block the sun, limit agriculture, and cause millions to starve. Climate scientists doubt that the US Navy, and Army can get their greenhouse gas emissions down to net zero by 2050. Climate scientists have committed civil disobedience, even in Lansing, to demonstrate their slogan, "No warming, no war." Headquartered in the United Kingdom is a group called Science Rebellion. Hear their novel proposal. They want to cancel the debt of countries in the global south in exchange for those countries keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Back to reality. William Perry, former Secretary of State, says the Ukraine war is a slow-moving Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Nuclear Doomsday Clock, is closer to midnight than during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It's only 100 seconds away from complete disaster. Another reality. Putin says Russia may use a nuclear weapon if it faces a, quote, existential, unquote, threat to its country, which now includes Eastern Ukraine. So, no first use is not ruled out, and right now Russia's conducting nuclear exercises. Biden says the US would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the US or its allies or its partners. Neither power has ruled out the first use of a nuclear bomb. Both countries are conducting exercises to fight a nuclear war this October. Fears of escalation mount. I just learned that the US Army's light infantry unit, they're called the Screaming Eagles, they're trained to deploy on any battlefield in the world within hours, ready to fight. And they have been deployed to Romania, only 3 miles from Russia. Now let's dig deeper into reality. What's the probability of Putin firing tactical nuclear weapons? There are no signs of Putin putting nukes into a position to fire on Ukraine. There are no significant nor large military targets that would be usual for a tactical weapon. And if Ukraine is part of Mother Russia, as he says it is, then why would he bring massive destruction and death and radiation on his own homeland? So how can Biden respond to what some people call nuclear blackmail? These are ideas that I just read in the Nation magazine. Biden could tell Putin that the US will not use nukes under any circumstance. If Putin uses even one tactical nuclear weapon, the West will redouble its supplies of conventional weapons to Ukraine. Economic sanctions on Russia will be bolstered by a complete embargo. Sounds like Kennedy's, quote, quarantine. Putin will be indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, and a warrant for his arrest will be issued. That's what Biden could spell out. But Putin's attempt at nuclear blackmail really requires proactive diplomacy. Of all people, Elon Musk has suggested that Ukraine cede its claims to Crimea. France and Turkey, who helped the grain shipments start from Ukraine, the UAE, Qatar, and the UN have all been suggested as mediators. On Monday, 30 House Democrats wrote a letter to President Biden calling for direct talks between Biden and Putin to forge a ceasefire. But on Tuesday, they withdrew their letter, a total mess. So what I say is that there needs to be a groundswell of public support for negotiations. So what might get Putin to a ceasefire and negotiations? Are there some off-ramps for him? Well, NATO could stop its nuclear exercises. Ukraine could declare it will be a neutral nation. The US could declare that NATO will not accept Ukraine as a member. Ukraine could agree to UN-mediated elections in Donbass region. Those are possible off-ramps for Putin. We can't forget about economics. The World Bank says a new Marshall Plan at this point will cost $345 billion for reconstruction and modernization of Ukraine. How could we or the world afford war and a new Marshall Plan? Well, we could tax the large fossil fuel profiting companies. We could tax the profiteering military contractors. We could pay farmers to produce more grain for the world. And long range, it means rebuilding Ukraine using solar and wind capacity. Well, back to the direct talks. They withdrew their letter on Tuesday. Diplomacy just is not popular. But look at the common sense in the letter. Biden should, quote, pair the military and economic support the US has provided to Ukraine with a proactive diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire, end quote. I submit that's not an extreme request. It's a request that we can make. After all, JFK resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis by combining military toughness with tough-minded diplomacy. And so I would remind us, we are the good guys. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dean Rusk reports, I argued against the surprise attack, pointing out that world opinion would turn against us because we didn't first try diplomatic avenues. President Kennedy worried about an adverse public reaction, including demonstrations and peace groups in the streets, perhaps a divisive public debate. People power, you and me, demand diplomacy now. So my suggestion for action is during working hours, dial the congressional switchboard, 202-224-3121. Dial it 3 times. Senator Peters, Senator Stabenow, and then your representative, probably for most of us, it's Andy Levin. Say something like, we need direct talks between Presidents Biden and Putin to get a ceasefire in Ukraine. Please tell President Biden to do diplomacy, to pick up the phone, call Putin, and get into direct talks. That's my advice, and I look forward to conversation about the Cuban Missile Crisis and Ukraine and what we might do. Thank you for paying attention.
Thank you, Rich. Can you stop the share now so we can see ourselves? Yeah, great. There is a question. If you know, can you clarify what Russia's nuclear exercises are and how can you simulate a nuclear attack, which is part of that?
What I do know is that you fly your bombers around, the bombers that would deliver nuclear bombs, and you put your ICBM crews on extra alert, and they practice going through the countdowns of how they would actually fire nukes if the order came from the president. That's true for both sides. By the way, earlier earlier this year, the US moved more B-52 nuclear capable bombers to Great Britain.
Okay, the next, do you know why the Congressional Caucus withdrew the letter?
Well, one answer is politics. It looks like appeasement, and that is not good just before an election. Some were afraid that it sounded too much like the Republicans, some of who have threatened to not give a blank check anymore to Ukraine. So they didn't want to be conflated with Republicans and politics with the election. And there seems to have been some mix-ups between the 30 offices of when to release it. That the letter was actually formulated back in like June and July when Ukraine wasn't doing so well. But now that Ukraine's doing well, there's a general idea that when you're going good, don't negotiate yet. Keep on pushing and you'll get a better negotiating position. So that's what seems to be behind the withdrawal.
Great. Sherry, do you want to share your experience in Ann Arbor about diplomacy not being popular?
No, it was the Green Party people calling out peace, and people were making faces. We didn't even get to that, just calling out peace. And I'm thinking, you know, that's not a way to get anybody's attention in this country.
Right. Okay.
I was trying to say free tuition instead of war.
Mm-hmm. You'd think
Bring
that
it
would
home.
be popular in Ann Arbor.
I think I saw all 110,000 students that day. I had no idea I'd be driving through Ann Arbor after the football game let out.
Oh, yeah. Yep, that's often a mistake. All right, next question. What does Honeywell do as it relates to nuclear weaponry? They used to be into other tech.
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that specifically.
Okay. The end of the chat questions right now. If you wanna any other comments, ideas?
I'm
Ron?
curious about the fact that Andy Levin didn't sign that letter. Does anybody have any information or insight about that?
He didn't?
No?
Rashida Tlaib is the only one from Michigan who signed the letter.
And Kildee is what, senator?
No,
No.
Kildee is a congressman,
He's
and
Did he
he's
sign
running.
it?
And he's running for office in a tight race in a new district. So given politics, I'm not surprised that Kildee didn't sign it.
Well, and Dow is in Midland, and Midland just got added to his district, conservative Midland.
right. That's
Well-
why it's a tight race for him. Yeah.
I know, I dug out names of 193 Green Party people who live in those 4 counties, and I told them, we're not running anybody, please vote for Kildee, and I told them why. Progressive Democrats and Greens are very, very similar in what they'd like to see.
So that was a good thing to do.
Thank you.
I see Steve Gold's hand up, Melanie.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
Thanks. We're going to have Andy Levin speak to us soon. And since he's been a committed progressive, and Ron's question is a good one. It's very surprising, especially since he's a lame duck and has nothing political to lose, as far as we're aware, as to why he would not sign on. There must have been some thinking behind it, though, and it would be good for us to understand that.
When was the letter signed? Because my understanding is that letter had been written quite a while ago.
Yes, it seems that some people signed the letter back in June and July.
Before the primary. Okay, that may answer Steve's question.
Oh, that's true.
Well,
Great. Also, so Linda Ashley says that she heard Timothy Snyder on the radio talking about Ukraine, and he really spoke about holding off on negotiations. Did anyone else hear it? And what do you think of it?
what was the reason, Linda?
He believed that that Ukraine, that the only thing, he's quite an expert in Ukraine, as you know. And that the only thing that Putin would respond to is the position of strength that Ukraine had now, that they were actually winning the war. And that was the only way to go, is to continue to have them win, quote unquote, the war as they are, show their strength. Otherwise, he would not be an honest negotiator, is pretty much what he said. I was pretty fascinated by that, because I know we have a lot of respect for him. I know that Steve talks about him all the time, and he's certainly not a warmonger, but I think that's the way that he perceives Putin.
But on the other side, what seems to be happening is increasingly battlefield successes in Ukraine, by Ukrainians, I mean, is encouraging them to think they're going to win the war. And
They do think they're going to win the war.
And there's increasing talk among policymakers and Americans in general about winning the war. And 5 minutes reflection or 30 seconds reflection tells us that that's absurd. Ukraine can't win the war because there are troops in reserve and weapons in reserve and forces in reserve that Putin can continue to use from now till, the next 10 years and not be exhausted, unlike Ukraine. So at some point, the only off-ramp is negotiations. Now, somehow, and maybe it's happening beneath the surface, maybe people aren't talking about it, the only solution has got to be Russia and Ukraine meeting. That's where I say direct talks matter, not between United States and Russia, but between Ukraine and Russia. When I first heard from Rich the slogan direct talks, I thought that's what it meant. But direct talks between Ukraine and Russia are the only way the war is going to end. It's going to end with some settlement that Ukrainians will have to accept, gritting their teeth, and sooner or later. So the idea that they should keep fighting and keep on getting countryside destroyed and keep on getting people killed, and to create this stronger and stronger sense that we must win and that we will win, I don't see that as leading to an intelligent resolution.
Well, what he said was all wars end with negotiation, but from a
Right.
position of strength, one side having the strength, and that Ukraine would be the side that has strength, whereas Putin's position in this war is diminishing. The people of Russia are coming out against the war, and this problem he has with getting new recruits and so forth. I mean, that was what he had. I remember him specifically saying all wars end with diplomacy, but one
Right.
side has to be stronger.
And I don't think Russia has an unlimited supply of recruits and people who support it, who are willing to fight. They're fleeing the country as fast as they can.
Yeah, he's in a pretty precarious situation now, Putin, in
Does
terms
That's
of,
assuming that's all true.
Let me make one comment and then go to Don.
Okay.
Winning the war, Russia is doing a pretty good job of destroying Ukraine's
That's
infrastructure.
true.
Its energy, electricity, and so forth. It could be a very cold, a very dark winter for Ukraine. And who knows if the West will hold together, because we also suffer from gas prices and so forth. So I think it's a really good debate about who's winning now or who will win in 6 months, because it sure looks like a protracted
Yes.
war. Over to Don.
Unmute yourself, Don.
One of the basic problems is the left is conflicted over this and there's no peace movement. And it seems like you could, the reason for the conflict is, the left says we have to support the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We have to give them weapons. Now that's true, but the problem, there's another side of it. And the other side is it's the official US policy, not just to preserve the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but to weaken Russia. And that's what has to be overcome. It's fine to give weapons to Ukraine for defensive purposes, but if you're giving weapons to Ukraine to defeat Russia, that's not going to happen, as Ron said, and that's extremely dangerous, and it could lead to a nuclear war. So I think those issues can be separated, and they should be separated. We have to overcome the official policy of the US government that they're not negotiating because they want to weaken Russia.
Oh, there's a question. What is a protracted war? What is the definition? Yeah.
A war that's longer than what you expect. Things just keep going on and on and on.
That's true.
I mean, first of all, Putin thought that they would take the capital, Kyiv, and boy, he could install his puppet government and away they would go. So it's certainly a protracted war from Putin's first volley. Steve's got his hand up again.
Yep, Steve, go ahead.
Couple thoughts. In a sense, wars always end with negotiation, in the sense that there are documents signed formally. But the Vietnam War, which was not won by the United States, which was always a million times larger and stronger than Ho Chi Minh's People's Liberation Forces, we didn't end as the stronger party forcing negotiations on Ho Chi Minh. We left with our tail between our legs, having accomplished nothing except massive death and destruction. So I think that history teaches that superpowers are sometimes willing to do that, and simply to leave. That's what Russia did in Afghanistan. They did not negotiate a peace with anybody. They stopped. They decided to do other things. I can't. With regard to Snyder, I shared a blog piece of his not too long ago. He downplays the seriousness of Russia's nuclear. Of the possibility of nuclear weapon use by Russia. He says it's saber rattling. It happens all the time. He gives historical examples, and he thinks that it can and should be downplayed greatly as a factor. Meaning, and I don't. He knows more about it than I do. I don't know if that's the case or not. But it would mean that we should not be panicked by the fact that Russia is a nuclear power to make decisions of any sort. if Snyder's position is correct, then he's puffing up his chest as Khrushchev did and saying, we have parity with you, NATO, United States. We are not going to be dominated by you. We will not lose by you. And we have just as much weaponry as you, and we're prepared to go on using it. But Snyder says this is often posturing and could reasonably be regarded that way. And one other point, but I can't remember what it was. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So, yes, Joanne. Unmute yourself.
I so appreciate the timeline in your PowerPoint of what happened in Cuba, which, I remember I had just graduated from high school in '62, and I was working on the 23rd floor of a building downtown thinking, I'm dead. We're going to be bombed. Detroit was one of those cities. And I remember like going to work and thinking that, it's going to be over. But it's 60 years ago. So it's just such a good, you did it so well and reminded me and, shared things that I never even knew, but then reminded me about some things that I do recall. So really good, really vital and helpful, putting it in relationship to what's happening now.
Well,
Connecting the dots.
thank you, Joanne. I appreciate the comment. I am afraid that there are too few people who have had that kind of concern or fear. And we've kind of grown immune to nuclear war.
Well, I don't think we can, me personally, I can't wrap my brain around it. I can't. But I just remember, I was 18 years old or whatever I was. And I just remember the seriousness of it, for those couple of weeks. And so you brought it back to life.
Okay.
So if there are no other comments, yeah, Phyllis.
Yes, I'm so glad that, Rich, that you did this, because I had gotten to the point where I didn't want to follow the news about Ukraine, because I can't stand to see how the country is being destroyed. And it's just nonsensical to keep going. Because they are, on some level, they're losing population, they're losing infrastructure. Where are they going to go from there? So I appreciate that, that Rich did this. And I feel that's a very good idea to start a campaign, demand diplomacy now. There is something we can do.
And some of the people in Ann Arbor are talking about rallying around diplomacy for Armistice Day, Veterans Day, November 11/11. So that, your communication could say, Armistice Day, Veterans Day, a great day for a truce.
Mm-hmm.
Well, people might not think it's our truce. It's not us. We're not the ones offering a truce. At least that just came to my mind when you said it.
Like,
Phyllis and I saw a film 2 nights ago by Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker. This was on the Criterion collection, by the way, which you can get on video. So we watched it on our TV. It's a film about a man who is obsessed by the threat of nuclear war in Japan in 1955. And unlike everybody else, who's kind of completely numb to the possibility, refusing to face it and think about it, this man is driven half crazy by it. He's actually constantly thinking about it, and he decides to move his family to Brazil to sell his steel foundry and to move his whole family, including all the children, nephews, nieces, everyone he can. And the family takes him to family court in order to get a judgment of incompetence against him because he's off his rocker. And the film is a drama about whether or not they're going to achieve that and what's going to happen if he loses and what's going to happen if he wins. But the interesting fact is, unlike everybody else, he's obsessed by it. And I won't give away the ending. It's a very good Kurosawa film, but it sort of reminds you that we all live, and I think that was his intention to Japanese, we all live with this in the background and we don't face it fully. So maybe there's one good thing that's happening in this process, which is more and more people are becoming aware that there are these nuclear weapons, that they are a threat, and that they can be used as a threat in the war, as Putin and Biden are using them in this struggle over Ukraine.
Right. So I would, now I'd think we should let Rich give a final comment, closing comment, and we'll stop the recording then, and then we can stay on and talk some more. But we're at
Well, I
an
want to say thank you for doing some thinking. I think that's what was the real goal of tonight. William Sloane Coffin said that the virtue of prudentia can be described as darn good thinking. So I hope you've done some darn good thinking and we'll keep it up. And I hope you'll find a way to act in some way so that we can stop this war. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Rich. This concludes the official program.
Thanks, Rich.
Recording is stopping now.
Thank you, Rick.